Welcome to the second day of the fourth Intellectual Property Awareness Summit. I am James Conley, a faculty member in the Kellogg Center for Research and Technology and Innovation at Northwestern University. I am co-hosting today's program together with Bruce Berman and his team at the Center for IP Understanding. Yesterday, we heard Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, a ranking member of the U.S. Judiciary Committee, highlight improvements around intellectual property as a legislative matter in the current term. Then we heard startup executive Ellington West lead a panel that included economist Lisa Cook of Michigan State University, Arthur Demarich of the Smithsonian Lemelson Center, and IP attorney educator Jesse Fenty answered the question, can the IP system effectively promote diversity and entrepreneurship? Then USPTO diplomat Michael Mangelson led a panel including Jeremy Waterman of the China Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and IP value researcher Mark Putnam to address the timely global question of what does China's IP rights explosion mean for innovation? Yesterday's conversation with panelists and online participants was rich, robust, and raised my awareness of important considerations for all involved with intangibles in commerce, the law, and/or government policy. We continue today our focus on this year's IPAS theme, IP and the lives it touches. Bruce, what's on the program for today?
Well, for today, we have a two interesting panels. One is, can schools teach IP more effectively to students? How can they teach IP more effectively, and perhaps why they don't already? The second panel will focus on value, IP value, and how the perception of IP rights and how they're regarded positively, negatively, and in various contexts, how that creates value or diminishes value. And we have a great panel for that as well. I also wanted to mention that yesterday, Senator Tillis talked about the need for collaboration between Democrats and Republicans. That's not new, but he also talked about patentability and the importance of understanding what patent eligibility is and policy needed to surrounding that. He also talked about the need for diversity as being a very high priority in his mind. He's the ranking member. He was the chair of that committee prior to the Biden administration. And finally, he talked about policy being, we have to make some hard choices with regard to IP in order to make it meaningful. I thought those were really apropos remarks. So the first panel today will be how can schools better teach students about intellectual property? James, you're going to lead that. James is a National Academy of Inventors member, as is, oh, I'm sorry, before we start, I forgot, forgive me, I forgot about Dr. West is going to deliver his keynote, and he is also a member of the National Academy of Inventors, as is James, but I'll let James introduce him. Please, James.
Thank you, Bruce. It is my privilege and honor to introduce today's IPAS 2021 keynote, Professor James E. West. Dr. West, as he'll explain, is the inventor of the foil electret microphone, a device that became so ubiquitous in its application, it literally touched the lives of many of us. Professor West is celebrated for his contributions over a 40-year career at Bell Laboratories and his growing body of work on the engineering faculty of Johns Hopkins University. Professor West is a recipient of the U.S. National Medal of Technology and Innovation. The remarkable Ellington West, who guided our first panel yesterday, is his daughter. His mother was one of the talented hidden figures charting the course of America's early space exploration program. This man and his family are literally inventing a better tomorrow. Professor West, welcome to IPAS 2021.
Thank you, Dr. Kellogg. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here to talk with you this morning. My talks are usually a little bit eclectic because I try to cover a variety of topics. So with that said, let me see if I can live up to the title of my talk here, microphones and minorities in STEM. Many of you know about the Football Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Baseball Hall of Fame, but the most important Hall of Fame is the National Inventors Hall of Fame. And the reason that this is very important is because none of the other halls of fame would be as famous as they are without communications and modern technology that inductees into the Inventors Hall of Fame have brought to all of us. If I were to, first of all, induction into the National Inventors Hall of Fame requires, one, that you have a U.S. patent, and you can be from anywhere in the world, but two, that patent must have had a tremendous influence or effect on the way we live and the comfort with which we live. If I were to ask you with that as a definition to name one person that you might think would qualify and be inducted into the Inventors Hall of Fame, and many of you would think of the telephone, and Alexander Graham Bell would be the person that would come to mind, and you'd be absolutely right. He is indeed inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame for the telephone. Now, if I were to ask you to name a Black inductee into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, many of you would think and think and think and think and perhaps come up with George Washington Carver. And again, you'd be right. He's well known for peanut products and the oils and things that he made from the peanut, but he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame for teaching crop rotation in the South. And the South did not erode away as did the Midwest. I visited Tuskegee University. It was my last trip before quarantine. And this was at the invitation of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, who's looking at historically Black universities for a university for which a center of excellence might be built and with the support of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Another inductee into the National Inventors Hall of Fame is Granville T. Woods. Now, Granville T. Woods had many, many patents. By the way, there are roughly 600 inductees into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, international people, and of that 630 Black inventors are inducted. And Granville T. Woods is one, but I can't talk about them all. I'll just want to stay along a single line, and that's communications. Among Granville T. Woods' inventions was a patent on a telephone transmitter. This patent was purchased by A.G. Bell, and it was the first mass-produced transmitter for telephony throughout the world. This microphone, the carbon microphone, the contact microphone, lasted until Gerhard Sessler and I invented the electret microphone, which replaced the carbon microphone in telephony. Let's talk a little bit about the sensor itself. In 1917, E.C. Wente invented the condenser microphone, looking for an improved microphone for telephony. But the unfortunate thing about the condenser microphone is, well, let's look at it from the fundamental standpoint. A sound wave impinges on a flexible diaphragm like a drum head, and there's a back electrode that's associated with this, and what happens is, as the sound wave impinges on the diaphragm, the capacitance changes, and this variable capacitance mimics the sound pressure on the diaphragm. But what we really want is the voltage. We want a voltage out And so therefore a big battery of around 200 to 300 volts were necessary. And although it is an extremely linear, the most linear sensor transducer or microphone that we have today, it required that high voltage, and that high voltage could not come down the line. So from 1917 until present day, when Sessler and I learned how to find the correct polymer with very deep traps, to be able to open those traps, jam an electron in, and then close that trap around that electron. Now, this electron is very unhappy because nature wants electrons in holes to be paired all the time. And so essentially what we've done is made the electrical analog of a permanent magnet. You know, if you have a magnet, you can take opposite poles and they'll attract, like poles will repel. Well, the same thing happens here in this case. And this charge that we're able to put in the polymer eliminated the need for the battery. And now, and by the way, the more popular version of this is to put the charge carrying polymer on the back electrode, and this allows you more freedom from the standpoint of the diaphragm. This is a German Finnick, which is smaller than our penny, but the microphones that Wente invented, the condenser microphone, you are very lucky if you can buy one of those for $1,000. They're far more expensive than that. But eliminating the need for the voltage eliminated all the protection that had to be done in order to make it safe for human use. And at the same time, it allowed us to make microphones of many sizes and many shapes. And this is a cutaway of the microphone showing the back electrode, which is perforated. And these perforations allow this back cavity to communicate with the stiffness of the air layer in between the back electrode and the polymer diaphragm. Again, many sizes and many shapes. And since 2005, at least 2 billion of these microphones are made annually. I'm reminded of a story. Once we were convinced that the charge had been stabilized in Teflon. In other words, these traps required an awful lot of energy, somewhere around 1.2 eV, in order to open that trap and let that electron escape. My director at that time asked Sessler and I if we'd be leaving Bell Labs and setting up shops in our respective basements to make condenser or make electret microphones. Sessler and I looked at each other and thought that this was really a crazy remark, because who would leave, what 12-year-old would leave a sandbox with all the toys he ever wanted to play with were available? So neither of us took that challenge to make microphones. And when you consider since 2005, 2 billion have been made almost each year, we would have been able to buy Bell Labs at that time. Where are these microphones? Well, they're in just about everything that requires a microphone, from your computer to toys. More recently, pneumonia takes the lives of between 1 million and 1.5 million infants each year. And and this is not acceptable because it's a very curable disease. The problem is in detecting it. And physicians and nurses can do this detection because they've been trained to listen to the lungs. And if they hear certain things, they know that this is it represents some danger. And so where are the 2 billion microphones? Well, in each one of these units, and I'll describe it more, has 6 microphones in it. One to pick up the external noise, that's the one that's on the outside, and an array of microphones on the side that faces that's placed on the chest of the human. And so your cell phone does not contain one microphone, but it contains up to 5 microphones. And so this is where a number of the microphones go. What we've been able to do with this device is, because we pick up a clean signal from the body. I won't play those for you. The artificial intelligence algorithm, which is on board on this device, can aid the user to detect pneumonia in infants. And it does it with an accuracy in the 91st percentile range, which means that it is as good as most highly trained professionals at detecting pneumonia. Microphones are ubiquitous with about everything we do, and are becoming even more ubiquitous when you consider what we're doing right now, when allowing all of us to get together and talk to each other. And thank you very much for your time.
Just before I introduce the next panel, or the first panel, and James Conley, I'd like to just mention, and some of you are already aware of this, that this week CIPU came out with a report. We call it report. It's not quantitative research about IP education, in this case in business schools. Some of the folks who are here today actually participated in it. Professor Weiner and Professor Kasznik as well, I believe. But what it is a look at what is being taught in business schools with regard to IP. And there are courses. There are actually 44 courses being taught. Unfortunately, not one is a required course, and many schools only have one course. And we try to delve into that a bit and understand why that's the case, where it's the case. We're not about casting blame. It's about trying to understand the dynamics of how does that happen and what departments are teaching IP. It's sometimes it comes out of the legal department, sometimes accounting or economics or innovation. So in any case, that is out this week. There is an article, an executive summary, if you will, in IP Watchdog, which you can read the short version. And then there's a longer version, the 18-page report. There's a link to receive that. It just came out. It took about 6 months to put together. It was a team of folks involved. And I just 1 or 2 key points before we go on. I'm not going to spend too much time. The top 20 business schools offer a total of 44 courses. 1/3 of the schools only offer 1 course. None have a required course. Leader is Harvard, 6 courses. Wharton, 5. Some have no courses whatsoever and offer them on an ad hoc basis. Actually, there are 2, I believe, Columbia and Cornell. The lack of data make in the findings and report, make it difficult to support the IP education argument. And finally, some B school educators do not believe that IP is best taught by lawyers. And that's something that is worth thinking about. And with that, I'll leave you there, and you can find it readily. And if you can't, just let us know. But this is a good segue. The reason why I'm announcing this now or reporting it is because this is a good segue into the panel that James Conley will be moderating on how IP is being taught in schools. And James, take it away.
Thank you again, Bruce, for the kind introduction. This panel will explore the question, how can schools better teach students about intellectual property? Joining me today is Efrat Kasznik, who is an evaluation expert who teaches at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. Stephen Weiner, a former chief patent counsel of SRI International, Stephen Weiner, apologies, who has been teaching at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And Dr. Stephanie Couch, executive director of the Lemelson MIT program. And my intention today is to have each of our panelists individually address this question, right? How can schools better teach students about intellectual property within the context of their own perspectives and experience? The makeup of the panel is diverse. We have an attorney, we have an evaluation expert, we have an education expert. Then we will have a free-flowing discussion before we take up questions from the audience. For those with comments and or questions, please add them to the chat function and they will be fed to us by the program moderators. So as the moderator, I will begin explaining how I think we can do it better. Please appreciate that IP as an elective and or a required course at Northwestern University is the result of a 20+ year commitment of multiple faculties from across the institution. It currently has many embodiments and curricular form factors, as I will call them, in management, engineering, design, medicine, and the law. What is common about all of those offerings, which may not have found their way into your report, Bruce, because they are taught outside of MBA programs, of course, is that they tend to flow from one particular group. It tends to flow from the early days of the mechanical engineering department, which I joined in 1994 after some time inventing with Jerry Lemelson, curiously enough. And so I came to the department doing things like Dr. West described. In my case, I was working on foundry processes, high pressure casting of aluminum, for example. But there were all sorts of interesting things about my experience before I came to Northwestern with small displacement internal combustion engines for all things weed whackers that were of great interest to the department. There's a lot of miniaturization and all sorts of interesting materials phenomena. All of that fed into a series of patents that I had written before I joined the faculty with Jerry Lemelson. And these patents took on all sorts of crazy commercial significance. And there was a licensing endeavor that we led. The business of that licensing became much more commercially significant than it was engineering significant. But there was a core group of faculty in that department who really found the initial course that I created very interesting. So that course grew amongst the engineering school. It's now taught by one of my former students. Then, of course, we took it to the Kellogg School, where it became part of the strategy curriculum. And it only got to the strategy curriculum via some strange swerve through the operations department. And my academic colleagues know how these curious evolutions come about. And I think, as Efrat will speak to, this course exists as an elective in the strategy major, my course called Intellectual Capital Management, and not intellectual property management, because it is a focus on intangibles and the strategic question of appropriability. Those are questions that are addressed in the strategy department. Intellectual property might get shoehorned into the legal department if I let it be entitled that way. So there is a game associated with exactly about how you entitle the course. Then, with degree programs evolving real time all the time, you can help to maneuver the content into emergent offerings in a way that helps us better reach a broader collection of future James Wests, for example, who will be able to use this information to bring what I call the fuel of investment interest to the fire of inventive genius. Now, the challenge for us at Northwestern is the technology of teaching today has dramatically changed from what it was 1 year ago. So the heavier lift is, in fact, keeping the content fresh. I need to introduce the story of James West, which I don't actually capture effectively in my course. I need to do this with all of the content, and it needs to happen real time. So making the course relevant and ideally suited for a broader audience is an ongoing challenge. Now, that is a biased explanation of my experience at Northwestern University. And what I'd like to do now is invite each of my panelists to give a similar explanation of how they've brought it and how they might improve it going forward. And I'd like to start with Efrat Kasznik from Stanford, who's done an interesting thing in what is the finance and accounting function over there. Efrat.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, James. I'm really happy to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces on the attendees. I've been a member of the IP community for many years. As James mentioned, I'm an IP valuation expert. I run a company called Foresight Valuation Group in Silicon Valley. I'm also very active at LES, currently chair of the valuation committee. In the context of this panel, I'm sitting here with my hat on as an IP lecturer, where I've been, which is a title that I've carried over the last 10 years since I started my class at the Stanford Graduate School of Business exactly 10 years ago, at 2011, at the height of the mobile patent wars and as the AIA was just kicking in. So those were very different times than the times we live in today. My goal was to introduce an elective that did not exist. And just to differentiate for those who are not that familiar with the curriculum of a graduate business school, which is an MBA program, it's usually a 2-year program. The first year has a lot of core classes. Core classes are accounting and finance and marketing. Those are the core classes. Everything else is elective. So IP is always, in my opinion, always going to be an elective. The challenge is to make it an attractive elective so that people actually take it. You're competing at Stanford Graduate School of Business has a broad range of electives. Many people are coming in from industry as well as professors. You're competing with Nobel laureates and you're competing with celebrities and athletes and CEOs and venture capitalists. So placing the class as an attractive offering, and to your point, James, what name do you call it? And actually my class still carries the old name as Intellectual Property, Strategic and Financial Management. But I do agree 100% that, and my point is that the first thing is to get people to take the class. And in order to get students to take the class, you need to stand out. You need to make by name, by topic, by description, make it relevant and interesting for students to get on their agenda. Otherwise, they're very busy, they have a lot of activities, and the class needs to stand out. It's not a core class, so they don't have to take it. So that's one. And by the way, my comments are summarized in an article that I'm happy to share on the chat later. My second point is, because I've just written an article summarizing my 10 years of teaching. So you will need to convey the value proposition. And I'm actually the one, I think, quoted in your article, Bruce, as saying that I don't think lawyers should teach IP to business students. I didn't mean it to come across as that harsh, but the first thing I tell my students on day one is, my conviction in teaching IP to, I'm coming from the world of, I have a very similar background. I have an MBA from UC Berkeley, actually. So, and I came into IP through litigation, like a few of my colleagues that I know. So really, the idea here is that it's not the most obvious career path for a business student. So why should you care about IP? So one of my introductions to the class is, don't let lawyers run the show in your company. So IP is a business asset. That's kind of my mantra. IP is a business asset. It needs to be managed by a collection of people in the organization, not just the lawyers. So, and in order for you, the business manager, to be able to manage IP, you need to understand something about the legal, but also something about how IP brings value, which is my third point, is really speak the language of business. So when you teach IP to business students, for example, I use the word IP assets. I actually use it in my practice as well, as opposed to IP rights, which is something a lawyer would use. So I use the word IP assets to kind of plant the idea of the IP is an asset, needs to be managed, can be measured. I'm a valuation expert, so I bring a lot of valuation into the class. Another important thing that I find in teaching IP to business students is tell a good story. And I work with a lot of startups, so it's not different from, when you pitch an idea to an investor, teach a topic through, case studies is a common way to teach in business schools. There aren't that many IP case studies. I've written my own case studies, actually, based on my experience and events in the industry. But, and as James mentioned, this industry is evolving all the time. I started in 2011. I feel like I need to change the stories that I tell and a lot of the business models every year, because we all know what happened to the enforcement business model. It went up, it went down, so there's a lot of changes and things that need to be incorporated in the class. Lastly, and I'll stop after that, is that the multidisciplinary nature is really important. And that's another thing that James mentioned is there's multiple departments teaching IP. I teach IP at the business school. My class is open to all graduate students at Stanford. I actually get a lot of law students because they don't teach the business of IP in law school. They teach the legalities of IP, how you file a patent, but how you value a patent, how you monetize a patent doesn't belong in law school usually. Engineering, medical students, and that really enriches the discussion in the class. And to the technological challenges, I just actually just finished teaching a whole class on Zoom, which is not an easy thing. But anyways, however you're teaching the class, the make of the class really makes a difference and makes it for a better experience for everyone. So that's kind of my high level overview of teaching IP in business school.
Thank you, Efrat. I'm sure the environment of Stanford is like many others. Competitive was the word you used. And we need to be ready to compete as instructors for our audience. Next, I'd like to hear from Stephen Weiner over at Wharton, who I know is also in another competitive environment.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Bruce. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, James West as well. What an honor and an inspiration to hear at least a slice of your experience. I learned from through my kids, who are now all grown up. When they were in elementary school, they learned that when they were in class and someone else was speaking and they heard something they resonated with, they should do this, connection, but keep your lips closed. So I was feeling that just about every sentence with Efrat. I really resonate with many of your messages. So I applaud that vision. Try to add a little bit of my own perspective. I'm a career intellectual property attorney and executive. About half my career in traditional private law firm environments, with a range of litigation work, transactional work, advisory work, strategy work, even some prosecution. I have a computer science and artificial intelligence background. I studied AI at MIT before we knew what it was good for exactly, as well as we do today. And I wanted to bring, teaching for me in this stage of my career is very much a work of passion. I think of my ideal audience as the students who aspire, these business school students, MBAs, and sometimes undergrads who aspire to be the best clients that I had throughout my career. What do I want my best clients to know? I want to empower them. I don't want to give them a sort of preliminaries in law, a primer in IP 101 that they could easily get in the law school if they so wish. This is to really enlighten and empower them to make better decisions as stakeholders in innovation. So some may be inventors. Some may wind up being, entrepreneurs who are named inventors on patents. A lot of them will be company executives and decision makers or corporate advisors or investors. They are stakeholders in innovation, and they need to understand how innovation-driven businesses are powered and have value added to them or not through the right IP assets. What kinds of transactions make sense? How do you assess risks involved, either from adverse patents or from when you're assessing the positive ones in a venture, with the help of attorneys? And I very much resonate with what Efrat said. The folks who are steering the wheel can't be the attorneys. They are not running the business. They don't really know the business. So good attorneys will give you wonderful advice about the nuances of patent law. You have to understand what questions to ask and what to do with the advice that you're given. So my class is built around exercises and assignments. That's what I've developed that put students into the roles of making the calls they will need to weigh in on. So we give them various types of technologies that are multi-featured. We kind of relive early days of Amazon, or we relive various big moments, the release of the iPhone. And we say, well, what should be protected there? You're the marketing person, you're the product person, or you're on the engineering team. What could you protect? And I'll give you some law to help you students about what's possible, what's not possible, but where are the linchpins? How do you understand what's going to affect the market? And how will this affect, if you're Apple, your ongoing war with Samsung? How do you expect a battle like that to turn out? And does it make sense to invest in it or not, or, you know, and why? If you're an investor and there's a startup in the automotive, you know, autonomous vehicle market that has been so patent driven and patent litigious in the past, what do you look for? What kind of questions would you ask your attorney, and what's realistic to expect? So we give them assignments that sometimes based on ventures that students at the University of Pennsylvania are actively working on. Sometimes they're students in my class, and we use their venture ideas and work them up in terms of deal opportunities and in terms of patent protection opportunities. What's gratifying to me is the feedback that I consistently often get from students is they will tell me that the experience in the IP strategy course is one of the more practical experiences that they have in their MBA training. I really couldn't aspire to anything more than that. I want it to be meaningful and not just kind of an interesting dip of the toe into the waters of IP, but really something that equips them to be better decision makers in the world of innovation.
Thank you, Stephen. I couldn't agree with you more. Making these things practical seems to motivate and thrill the students. Next, I'd like to hear from Dr. Stephanie Couch at MIT, who leads the Lemelson program there and has a very broad reach beyond what is management education platforms.
Yes, and if we could show the slide, that would be really great. Is that possible?
I think you have to. There we go.
Here we go. Okay. Yes, so the Lemelson MIT program is part of the School of Engineering. It's been around for over 25 years now. And we really are focused on patents, so a slice of IP. And we're focused on first, we have given a $500,000 prize each of our years to prolific inventors. Back to what Dr. West said in the very beginning, that we want these role models out there in the world for young people to understand that there's this whole world of inventing and intellectual property, and here are examples of people that you could emulate in your life. So that's one of the roles. Another role that we've played is we've had a student prize program, and for the last 7 years, that's been a national prize. So we scour the websites of colleges and universities, and we find students on your campuses who have created inventions. Typically, they have protected their intellectual property in the form of a patent. We beg them to apply for our collegiate student prizes, and then again, we celebrate them in the media. We use them as role models for younger students in K-12 to show what is possible. But I joined 5 years ago, and the reason I was especially interested in joining was the program that we have at the high school level. And in that program, which grew up since 2003, we work with 15 teams of high school students and their teachers every year, and they find problems they want to solve in their local communities. Each one of them finds whatever they want, and we take them through the invention cycle of really coming to understand that problem well, designing a technological solution, creating a working prototype, and then bringing that to a culminating event. And we take them through how to protect their intellectual property before they come and showcase at this very public event. And 12 of those high school teams have received patents for their work. I just put in the chat a link to our announcement today of yet another team that's just filed. We have several in the process, thanks to programs like Microsoft's Make What's Next. And so I'm telling you all of this because you know, I have been in education policy my whole life at different levels. I'm an educational ethnographer. I like to understand what programs and experiences like this mean to the students and what difference they make in people's lives. And what I can see in my world is you don't just wake up interested in IP. And the interest belongs to a lot of people beyond those that you're going to find in your business majors. Once they have created something that matters to them and to people they care about in their communities. So I find this whole, we call it invention education. We've actually written a framework about it and everything. I find invention education to be a necessary component to IP education programs and to entrepreneurship programs, especially if we're serious about bringing more diversity to those who are patenting and benefiting financially from their creative potential.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Couch. I now like to sort of turn the lens on what we can possibly do to really motivate and engage these students. As Stephanie said, you know, people don't wake up thinking about this. And I know that the programs at your respective institutions have been successful because of your ability to sort of translate and get people engaged with this. So I'll tell you what I do at the Kellogg School, and especially because we are such a big marketing institution and there's just literally hundreds and hundreds of students taking branding classes. One of the things that I do is I pitch the topic as, listen, you need to own what you create, whether it's a brand, whether it's an invention, whether it's some musical score, you need to own that. And the way to own is through this stuff called IP. So let's think about ownership and leverage thereof so that you can experience the appropriability that, you know, David Teece talks about in his 1986 paper, which is the foundation of my course. I think we'll hear from him in the next panel. But I'd like to pose that question, or maybe you know a better way. How do you, for example, do that? Bring them in. What I know that Efrat has used the word value proposition. She's quite good at that. But Steve, I'd like to ask how you do it at Wharton first, and then get the response from others.
Well, a dimension that's very active that I'm exploring, expanding along right now, is integration with more and more of the student competitions, business prize and innovation prize competitions that are going on. We just had our so-called Y prize announced. Exciting new ideas are pitched. We're an educational institution. Now, some of this is about enabling students and motivating them to, you know, maybe create the next great venture out there. Part of it is a learning experience. We're equipped. Part of this learning experience for the full, well-rounded, successful entrepreneur should be learning about and appreciating IP. So I would say to a person, these teams will have on their timeline about where they're going, you know, as part of their pitch. So a year out from here, you know, 18 months out from here, when we've got some money, then we're going to look at IP. You know, then we'll have, you know, we'll throw it over the fence and we'll hire some law firm to look at IP. So first of all, that's not, all of us know that's not an optimal way to start your business. That's not as good, but just purely from the educational experience, it's fun, it's exciting, and it's really value adding to these students. To, you know, let's include some of that. Let's make that part of what these teams are expected to do. What does your landscape look like from an IP standpoint? What do you begin to, you know, do the homework? And then, you know, we all know, all of us know that 18 months from now, when they do hire a lawyer, they're going to be in such better shape, and that attorney or law firm will have so much more to work with. That's value adding for their venture.
Stephanie, what are you doing at MIT to sort of draw them in? What kind of language are you using?
Yeah, well, I actually, because we have the student prize, have been able to see lots of different models out there, not just at MIT, but I kind of see two kinds of models typically at our campus and at others. One is more sort of this cafeteria model where there are these challenges and all these different kinds of experiences that collectively really give a student all they need to thrive and protect their IP. But a student has to know about all those things and know they should attend and be interested enough to show up. So there are some challenges with that sort of cafeteria model. So what I'm starting to see is some campuses, as part of the freshman experience, are bringing students who've been through those in to talk to the students from the beginning and sort of creating that roadmap in the brain from the day they step on campus. And so I think that's a really exciting emerging practice. The other is I just have to tip my hat to Johns Hopkins and their biomedical engineering program, where it's a very carefully designed intergenerational, multi-stepped program that's team oriented for the students. And they have consciously cultivated a problem bank and people that the students can go sort of jumpstart their process to find that good thing to create. It's a fascinating program, and many of our prize winners have come from there. So lots of approaches that are out there.
So, but you're bringing this content in through, like Stephen mentioned, these other competitions. So, there's some competitive dynamic that's launched, and then the IP becomes a component of this. It's sort of a bit of a Trojan horse model. Am I describing it in an appropriate way?
Yeah, so in the first model, yes. Mm-hmm. And then in the second model at Johns Hopkins, is actually part of a much more intentional structured program that goes all the way from selecting a problem, developing an invention, and then thinking about how you protect it and commercialize it.
I know you're working with the Michelson Foundation on a number of initiatives, Stephanie, which would be at other kinds of institutions. Could you just say a word about that for a minute? Because I know there's resources going into this effort.
Yeah, well, the Michelson Foundation has their own open source courses and materials and resources they're putting out for the education community. The US PTO continues to evolve a set of robust resources. The US Intellectual Property Alliance that recently launched is also, I think, a wonderful new occurrence to begin to aggregate across different groups that have resources. And I'll tell you why that's so important. We've recently started an effort with the California Community College Chancellor's Office and 4 of the community colleges to take this high school model and build it out as community college offerings for adult learners. And, they don't have the kinds of technology licensing offices that students at a 4-year university, may have. And so where are they going to get access to the intellectual property information? And so, this idea of starting to bring together a virtual resource center and a go-to place is really important for really democratizing this whole area.
Before I get to that, I want to pick up on that thread. I want to hear from Efrat, because I know that there are so many people trying to teach super competitive. Well, just the environment of getting the students in the Stanford campus has got to be as dramatic as it gets. So I'm curious how she pitches it in a way that brings them in and then, lays down this foundation using valuation, which is a very quantitative discipline. How do you do that, Efrat?
Okay, yeah, I've a couple follow-up comments and then I'll answer your question. So first of all, in terms of how to integrate it more in curriculum, I want to offer a third model, which is something that has been done at Stanford on and off, not through the business school, but the OTL, the Office of Technology Licensing at Stanford, had a program called iFarm, where I was one of the faculty teaching there for a few years, that integrated OTL patents with multidisciplinary groups from various schools, including business school, engineering, and other schools as well. So I think there's no formal competition that I know about. There's many other competitions, but that is the closest that I can think about. And it was a very successful model, and the end result of that would be like a business plan. And I don't know if they went to pitch for funding or not, but so that's because there's so many patents sitting on the shelves of tech transfer offices, as we all know, which is a different problem. Another thing, so you asked, how do you pitch valuation? Well, valuation is the easiest thing to pitch your business student, because they, people are really motivated by I don't want to say making money, but generally speaking, it's one of the goals of a business, at least. So actually, I think that fits into maybe in the particular location of Stanford, at the heart of Silicon Valley, that really pitch in my mind, and I kind of see it as a tangential cause for me personally, is to educate investors, where there's a long way to go to understand IP and how it brings value to a startup, which this is another topic we can do a whole panel on, but just to bring that, why is that important in the business school context? Because these are the future VCs. These are the future corporate leaders, or a lot of these are going to either invest in startups or acquire companies through an M&A deal. So it's really, really important, particularly for the MBA students, to understand how IP brings value. So I'm very focused on value. I'm a valuation, I'm a numbers person. Actually, my first job out of business school was for David Teece, who I see sitting here at LECG. So I came from quantifying damages. That was my foray into IP. IP is much more than just damages. I truly believe, as my career evolved into managing IP as a business asset, not just as a litigation asset currency, but doing things like spin-offs, where I've seen wonderful things done by Steve at SRI, where they spun out companies like Siri, and so a lot of that is based on IP, bringing IP into the market, and the valuation underlies all of that. So if you don't understand how IP brings value, where there are multiple values, not just one value, and it really depends on the business model, who's doing it, then in my mind, I would be remiss, because again, I bring my personal angle into it, if I didn't touch on valuation. Another thing that I found useful, and that goes into one of Stephanie's comments about focusing on patents, which that has actually been my focus for the first 5 years I was teaching that, because I'm mostly a patent, doing most of my work around patents, but so many new intangibles are coming into the market now. I found that, for example, trade secrets are very important. I started talking about that, as well as even brands and some of the marketing IP. And I would say that in the last 2 years, I talk a lot about data, because data is, in my mind, is new intangible. Students always have a lot of questions about AI and some of these business models that rely heavily on data. So again, I try to make it relevant based on the business models I see in the market, kind of what are the new startups, what are the new industries that are coming up. For me too, I also brought in life sciences into my class. Again, I'm not that, I'm doing life sciences work. It's not my main focus, but I've done a lot. But so I tried bringing, and to do that, I bring experts on the outside. So I would bring somebody to talk about, for example, I had a speaker that talked about patenting AI in life sciences. That was one of the most well-received talks in the class today, this year. So students are really interested in a lot of so you have to keep it relevant and have your finger on the pulse of the technology market, because this is IP. So we're not teaching, and that's why the case studies need to be updated all the time. And that's why I think it's a little more challenging than teaching marketing, but even marketing is changing. But there are some core subjects that are not changing as much. And this is a subject that changes a lot. So you really have to make it relevant. And that's one of the ways to convey the value proposition in my mind. So.
Great. Thank you, Efrat. Now, Bruce or Komal, if there's any questions from the audience, let me know, and I will certainly insert them in here. But while I'm waiting, now that I have 3 of what are clearly the leading sort of horsemen taking this topic forward, and what are the preferred venues of education, MIT, Wharton, and Stanford, I have to ask the question, how do you scale what you do? Because quite frankly, if we don't scale what you do, we're really not going to be able to spread the word. This is something I confront on a daily basis. The only thing I've been able to do is, put more students out there. So I got David Orozco at Florida State and a whole group of them in Europe and one in Japan. But that takes years to grow PhD students and send them out there, right? I keep running into David Teece's disciples in various places. But we've got to be able to use technology to do this. Have you thought about this? How do you take, for example, what's at Wharton, what's at Stanford, what's at MIT, and how do we spread it to the land-grant institutions and other places that may not have a Lemelson Center?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So this, you asked the hard question that is on my mind every single day. And that's why I am so very excited about this work with the community colleges, because I can see where if we can get these courses and/or workshops, there's combinations of both being piloted, that count for degrees, certificate paths, those sorts of things, but really begin to make this knowledge, it's really a process, right? You go through a process when you create something that you can then protect. If we can get that happening in these hubs across the US through the community colleges, but to do that, we're going to have to take some of the know-how of these very talented faculty, very talented students, and promote a collaboration with students and faculty at the community colleges. It needs to be a collaborative production here. And so in the next 4 years, that is something we're going to work really hard to try to figure out how you do it without taking away from the work of the institutions, individually, and how, and yet how to take snippets of time and make it matter in a collaborative way. The biggest thing right now comes to something you mentioned that I'm going to turn the question back at you, if you don't mind. And that is, as we do this work with the community colleges, we're having to invent whole new structures because we're so siloed in higher ed, right? You have the engineering path, and you have the business path, and you have the transfer path where you get the English, right? So we're having to bring a faculty team across the institution, along with an administrative lead empowered to work across the institution to even create these courses and what they're going to count for and how they're going to get assessed. And it's a whole governance thing. And you mentioned it when you talked about the struggles of going from MECI to how you even name your course in business. I mean, do we really have the right structures to allow for where we need to go for this more flexible kind of teaching and learning program that can address needs with rapid technological change?
Well,
Jane?
Stephanie, is that a question for me? Okay. Is that David Teece over there trying to speak? David's weighing in.
After you, James. I've got a point to make.
I'll be brief. This is a commitment that is longitudinal. It's worked at Northwestern because of the 20 years of dogged pursuit. Okay, and it's largely, again, led by me and several others who just believe in this. Now, the beauty of what's going forward is artificial intelligence should help us pick up all this learning, train the model, and figure out how to create the courses that might work for each and every possible instructor, whether they're an economist like David Teece, whether they're a lawyer like Steve Weiner, a valuation expert like Efrat, or an education expert like you, Stephanie. I think that we should be able to do that. And that's how I think scale might occur. David.
I think you have to look at both the supply and the demand side. And you're talking about the supply side. And, this little group here is actually, we could be scaled if there was demand for us. But I think the weakness is actually on the demand side. And that's really going to pick up a little bit with what I'm going to say on the next panel. Look, big corporate America is ambivalent about IP. We all know that IP is critical for the economy. It's critical for the small inventor. It's critical for small to medium-sized organizations. But part of that profiting from innovation framework that Efrat was so kind to mention is that complementary assets can help out if in terms of appropriability if you're a big guy, if you got the complementary assets. So you look at what's happening out there. You know, the Apples and the Googles and Amazon, they want to say, they're ambivalent. They say, our IP is incredibly valuable, but you know what, yours is not. They're not consistent. They want to have it both ways. And they know that there's a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that have got, you know, IP. So they've actually crapped all over the IP system of the United States over the last 20 years.
That's a term of art.
Yeah, it is a term of art, but it's kind of what's happened. That's why I wanted to be a little vulgar, because we have to realize that's what's going on. I mean, when I was in graduate school, there was the big companies that had IP and they're in favor of IP. And then they changed their mind when they realized that, you know, the birth of the venture capital industry, actually most of the invention was actually coming from outside. And then they had to, you know, not just receive, but actually had to be on the paying side. So, you know, guys like Tim Cook, I want to take them behind the woodshed every now and again, because they are, they're actually shooting themselves in the foot, because in the long run, the United States is the world's greatest creative and inventive economy. And as we go into global competition, they've managed to screw up the IP system in the United States and outside the United States by jumping on to the competition policy guys, my economist friends, who hate any kind of intellectual property because they have this narrow static view that anything that raises prices is not good. And intellectual property raises prices, so it's not good. I call it the naive economists. Of course, most sensible economists and the Nobel laureates, they always know that innovation is critical and IP is critical, but you've got this sort of very large number of feeble-minded folks that actually think that anything that stands in the way of price, of a better price for the consumer is a tax. So, you know, you saw that in the FTC case against Qualcomm, you know, my good friend Carl Shapiro labeling the royalty as a tax. Well, at least part of it is a tax, to be fair to him. And that's the way they think. And that plays to the interests of big corporates. So I think the supply side would figure that out pretty quickly, James. Would put you in a can and would use AI and would scale you quite well. But there's no demand.
I think that might be happening already. Thank you for your frank comments, Professor Teece, especially about your Berkeley colleague, Carl.
If I might jump in here quickly, I think that's what telling the story really helps, because of my students, the first question I ask them is, what comes to mind when you hear the word patent? And it's always like innovation and things like that. It's very rosy. And I feel like I'm actually kind of a downer. So I really want to tell it like it is. And it's very challenging in the IP marketplace right now. And I think it's my role as an IP educator, not to just convey the value proposition of why you need IP, because it's a little bit of scaring them. So you know, you tell stories about, you know, all sorts of, you know, legal litigation stories and things like that, stories about NPEs, which may or may not be scary anymore, depending on how you look at it. Actually, the NPE business model is a perfect example. When I started teaching the class 2011, you know, top year for like company like Intellectual Ventures, then things went down a little bit, you know, with IPRs and things like that. And now things are coming back because you have so much funding for litigation. So I think they, as business students, have to understand that. So a lot of what they need to understand is what influences the market. It's not just like IP equals innovation and all is nice. There's forces at play. How does the PTO impact? How does the Supreme Court impact? How does the Ellis decision impact? So things like that. And I think that's really, really important. And a lot of that is through telling stories with names that they know. Uber, you know, just mention names to them, not from 20 years ago, but names from today, companies that they know from the paper, that you know, that they can understand. IP can be great, but IP is really a risk, and they need to be able to hedge the risk. And it's their role as business leaders to understand that. And if they don't understand it, they can't really do that. So that's kind of my point. And I know, I'm sure Steve has a lot to say about that too. But
yeah, Stephen, if it's demand that's needed, how do we increase demand?
So I want to talk a little bit about some convergence trends. and the growing importance, emergence of data as a driver just across industries to many businesses. That is bringing copyright kind of front of mind. I think Efrat may have mentioned trade secrecy, but interesting digital copyright issues. So I saw an example of this in the media industry, where you have a company, I don't know, Comcast might be an example, but companies where they have an interest both in the technologies that distribute and deliver content in cool new ways and interact with it, and also in the underlying properties. And so one part of their brain is saying, you can't copy that. And another part of their brain is saying, well, make it very easy to access things online and, kind of harvest and mine data. And if you're, Google, you may have both mentalities competing in a very healthy way to add value. So I actually see the convergence of patents and copyrights, data along with technology, life science and information science. So now, almost every medical device company is also an information science company, and drug discovery, that's increasingly true. So it helps people who are stakeholders to see the other point of view. Nobody can afford to wear only one hat on this and be completely, anti or completely pro. And so I think that's going to be motivating and helpful, and makes it easier to tell stories that kind of bring people into a healthy discussion, and not just some of the things that we saw in the last, I don't know, decade, where you had kind of, I agree, a kind of entrenchment in big tech, where it was like, IP bad. I think that will of necessity be changing, and some life science companies are also seeing what it means to be dependent on building block IP. It's not single compound anymore. It's a lot of technology driven discovery and device work.
I think we're running out of
James,
time here.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think we have one more minute for you to sum up, James.
Well, first, let me thank our panelists, Stephen Weiner, Efrat Kasznik, and Stephanie Couch, with David Teece chiming in from UC Berkeley. This is an important question for obvious reasons, and it's self-evident to all of us who are on this panel and attending this IPAS summit. I think actually that the university itself is going to be changing fundamentally, dramatically changing over the next 5 to 10 years. The model of the faculty that was started and based on the canonical Catholic priesthood is going to be disrupted, and it's being disrupted real time. We just want to make sure that this topic isn't lost in all the noise of that disruption. And it's important, as we heard yesterday, because of the way that certain nation states are using it as a policy tool and not just a rights regime to incent the action of individual innovators. That was covered in the second panel yesterday. So I'm really very grateful for all of your thoughts and for the comments. We had a lot of good ones about data in the chat. We'll follow up with those individually with participants. Bruce, I hand it back to you to introduce the next panel.
Thank you, James. That was absolutely terrific panel. And it's a beginning, not an end. Hopefully this kind of dialogue between IP educators is going to continue. There seems to be a real need for it. Why it hasn't happened to date, I'm not quite sure, but it doesn't really matter. We need to do it. So that's wonderful. And this next panel is an excellent segue, because this is a discussion of largely evaluation and how we see IP assets, how we perceive them, how different stakeholders perceive IP assets. That's enormously important. And indeed, who is an IP stakeholder these days? That's a really expanded kind of environment. So I will hand this over to Brian Hinman. Brian, just in a way of a quick introduction, is as experienced as any IP professional I've ever met. While not a lawyer, he's worked in licensing, headed licensing at IBM. He's head of innovation at Aon IP Solutions, and he started at Allied Security Trust. He was a senior executive at InterDigital and IP and Verizon, I believe, and he was chief IP officer at Philips, reporting, I believe, to the CEO. So he's really a very interesting guy. Brian, let me hand this over to you and take it away.
Thank you, Bruce. And thanks for, special thanks to CIPU for an outstanding program so far for 2021. I've participated in a couple of the sessions. I've served on the board proudly since its inception, and we've made tremendous progress, as Bruce has outlined, in furthering the CIPU mission, which I encourage you to look on the website. We've got an exciting agenda of different events. But with that in mind, we've got an excellent panel assembled today to explore this whole idea of what we call the perception premium, which is really how IP understanding really promotes value. We're going to hit on value quite a bit. So I'm proud to introduce the panel members that will help think through this issue: John Kelley, David Teece, and Zeeger Vink, all of which really bring a fresh perspective on this and other IP issues that we're going to talk about today, given their deep history of IP and also in innovation. But before I start with questions on the panel, I wanted to sort of frame the discussion a little bit. So IP understanding is really where it starts, with fundamentally thinking about knowing how to capture innovation, really knowing how it's captured and understanding why it's important to the enterprise. Whether you're a small company, large company, university, whatever entity you belong to, it's very important. But with this historic, and you've all seen this chart, you see this historic rotation of tangible to intangible values since 1975, where we've really shifted to intangibles that most of us have seen. But really, any company really has reflected the ability to embrace the value of IP and are reflecting that in their business strategy overall. And I think it all starts with this common understanding of the different types of IP and knowing what the right mix of that IP is for the enterprise in order to capture, in order to fully enable that business strategy and really embrace revenue generation, because there is that correlation. And that's the tricky part, figuring out the correlation between what you've got by way of your IP stack, that's what I call it, whether it's patents, know-how, copyright, trademark, trade secrets, even data and, in designs. Really, what is that, and how does that directly correlate or translate into revenue generation? We're really going to talk about that today and how that's done. We're also going to talk about developing and implementing an IP strategy. It really cuts across each business unit. So when I was at Philips, for instance, we were embedded into each business unit, and the strategic plan on record for each business unit and for the company overall directly reflected a chapter, if you will, on intellectual property to really, in a sense, outline the value as well as some of the challenges associated with competitors as well, and how does that affect you from an IP perspective. But how do you embrace this and fully execute on your business strategy? We'll talk about that. And then the last thing is really translating IP strategy into ROI, really looking at what kind of return on your investment can you attribute to that IP. Looking at enterprise value is key, but that requires careful thought, analysis, and the ability to reflect the direct correlation between IP value and enterprise value, because so many companies think of IP, and it is treated in a lot of companies as a cost center. I was under the luxury at Philips and having it be a profit and loss. It was their own business unit. But so many companies are thinking of it as a cost center. And if you're thinking of it that perspective, then you look at the cost of generating the IP. But unless you're seeing that return on investment, it becomes difficult to look a CFO in the eye and say, give me this money. And he's going to say, okay, what do I get for my investment? So that's where we're going to start, actually, the discussion. So the first question I'm going to pose to the panel generally is really, how does an increased understanding of IP, general understanding, help companies think about and really promote IP value in the enterprise? And how do companies instill this understanding across the enterprise to obtain C-suite buy-in and acceptance? It's a difficult couple of questions, but I'll open it up and let whomever wants to start. John, maybe with your role at IBM, and it was quite exciting to work under you, by the way. Perhaps maybe you can share that perspective, having really led that organization.
Yes. So thank you, Brian, and thank you to the entire team. I really enjoyed the last session. I guess I would begin, in a sense, I'm reiterating a few of the points from the previous session, but I think it's important to stop thinking about IP as something separate. from the business, from the product, from your engineering. We in IBM and other places, I've seen successful buy-in from the businesses and the C-suites. We completely erased that line. And Brian, you saw it when you were at IBM. This is not a separate organization that is run by, the legal department. It is owned and operated by the businesses, and is a business in and of itself, but doesn't really hold a P&L. All of the expense and the benefits of licensing flow back into the business. So we have consciously erased every line between the business and the entity. And I would urge people to think about it, the mindset, in the old days, we might have a separate quality or a separate reliability organization responsible for products, product reliability, quality. We erased those lines years ago because it's critical that the product people, the business people, own this and make the trade-off decisions. And then the last point I'll make, Brian, is, and this somewhat relates to the last one, what we've done is consciously brought all of the business leaders into these decisions. So in IBM, we run a IP advisory committee, which is the senior VPs of the company. I led the meeting, but every senior VP from every unit was in there every quarter to go through any IP issues. And that was both a buy-in, but an education for them. And I think, Brian, if you had chosen any other IBM senior vice president to sit here today, they could speak to this topic as well as I can. They really have learned it. And I think the correlation I would make to the last, or suggestion I would make for the last committee, is maybe it's better to go teach the teachers than teach the students. Why wouldn't you go? We talked about how do we scale? Well, why don't we go and teach the engineering faculty so they can make it part of their course? Why don't we go into marketing and make it part of their courses, as opposed to a standalone sort of course that we're trying to attract students into? So every place you can erase the lines between IP and business, or IP and the core curriculum, I think is a positive. And it works, and it's worked for us for decades.
Great, thank you. David or Zeeger?
Yeah, let me just build on those excellent comments. I think you're fundamentally correct that we have to think of IP as not something off in a separate category, but is actually foundational to the competitive advantage of the business enterprise. If we stay focused on, how does a company differentiate and stay differentiated in a positive way? If you ask that question, what's the basis of our competitive advantage, and get people to drill down, and they'll point out, well, we're different in important ways. And then you go to the foundation of those differences. It's around knowledge, it's around technology, maybe around brands, but it's fundamentally around things that are non-imitable. And they're non-imitable either because they're hard to copy, or because they're both hard and they've got strong IP protection of one kind or another. So not seeing IP issues as a silo, but actually very core to the foundations of a company is exactly the way to go. But what we're always up against is, the sort of, if you will, the mentality of the office of the CFO, where they don't necessarily, they're looking at the balance sheets that got all the wrong stuff on, and all the right stuff is off the balance sheet, other than cash. So we got financial accounting systems that sort of stand in the way. There's a very distorted notion of what goodwill is, to the extent to which intangibles have historically been recognized, it's in goodwill. But, there's a great quote that I used from Warren Buffett, where for 30 years he was sort of blindsided from this stuff, because the only goodwill is that which flows from whatever premium you pay in M&A, and all the important goodwill, or all the important intangibles are just not there. So So you both have to think about it in an integrated way, and also put the office of the CFO in the right place, in the corner, and or educate them that in fact what they're looking at is very busy creating accounts that are not really representative of what's important. You have to dig to the foundations of cash flow to understand valuation. Of course, you can give any good financial accountant cash flows and they'll tell you what value is. But if you ask where the hell did the cash flows come from in the first place, that's where they've got blank stares. Stares, S-T-A-R-E-S. So we have a chance and a need, I think, to build the narrative of the importance of IP and intangible assets. We all know at some level, at least most people know, that value comes from primarily today from intangibles and less so from the tangible assets. But it's not just that point. It's saying, look, the tangible stuff you can buy. It's sort of commodity-like. Everybody can buy most pieces of equipment. Everybody can build a factory. But what you can't buy in many cases is know-how. So that's the direction of travel I think we need to go. And I think, some progress is being made, but we have still many ways to do, much to do.
Yeah. Zeeger, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, it's about education, of course, and it's easier to. It's sometimes easy to explain what the potential value can be and why we should have something and why we should invest in it. In reality, sometimes it's even easier or much easier to show the mistakes. Sometimes there are conflicts, sometimes there's something we lost, and then suddenly everybody realizes, "Ooh, yes, we made a mistake in the past, or we didn't look at it, we didn't invest in it." So I think having a couple of examples up your sleeve when you confront senior level management is sometimes very useful.
Yeah, and I think it's a cultural mindset. John, it was great being part of the IBM culture because it was inbred within the business. The appreciation was there for IP. At Philips, it was the same way. And what I did there was actually incorporated into the objectives and goals of every senior vice president within Philips, that they had an IP objective, whether or not it's a filing strategy, supporting the licensing, or whatever it was. So if it's part of their goals and objectives, guess what? It's part of their measurements when it comes time for bonus time. So they're really incented to help you achieve your objectives by making it part of their objectives. And I also presented to the board. So the board got the value of it as well, because they wanted to be aware of what risks are on the horizon, as well as what are the, are you achieving the revenue objectives as well as the patent filing objectives, et cetera. They took an active role in wanting to understand this. But that's a luxury a lot of companies want to try and achieve, but you have to try and embed that in the culture. I think that's really super important. Another question, John, is really with respect to IBM as a proud, long history of having led the U.S. and issued patents every year for 28 years, I think now. Yeah. And every year that you've been leading the organization, most certainly. But how and why do you do this so systemically? I guess that's an interesting question.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Brian. And actually, you said the word in your comments a moment ago. It starts with culture. You can't do anything for 28 years in a row without it being a cultural, sort of a natural thing. Yeah. So we've built a culture not around IP, but a culture around innovation, which is fundamental to the company. It's the reason we're 10 years old plus. So it's all around innovation, and IP and the things that many people refer to as IP is just a way to capture that, but it's a culture of innovation. And I often say, I couldn't stop this if I wanted to within the company. It's so fundamental. Now, cultures, though, can be disturbed. And so the second thing we do is we constantly recognize and reward the culture of innovation. And we do that through, technical awards, innovation awards, national medals, patent awards. So we really make sure that the culture doesn't flitter away on us by simply reinforcing it. And then the third thing, which we talked about, is we've made it so core to the business units and the businesses and the developers and the researchers that to them it's not something separate. It's just part of what they do, and it's part of the corporate strategy. And I guess I'll make it 3+1, since the comment around the economics of it came up earlier in CFOs. Our CFO wouldn't think of not investing in IP because he and his past 10 or so predecessors understand the importance to the company in terms of the size of our portfolio. Yes, we have a large licensing business, but just from a freedom of action and defense standpoint, the last thing any operating entity wants to do is try to visit IBM on an infringement, because our portfolio is so big and so broad. So it's both a defensive, but it's a well-gauged, licensing so that it is material for the company. So culture, reward, build it into the business, and then have a business model that's sustainable. And then, as I said, with those 3+1 things, I couldn't stop it if I wanted to.
Yeah.
John, I just want to say something, Bruce. So not to be the fly in the ointment, but I think that IBM's licensing revenues, and that's patent, copyright, and I think maybe know-how as well, it peaked around 2013 at about $1.6 or $7 billion. Nothing to sneeze at. But in recent years, it's come down to about a third of that. Now, just looking at that linear level of revenue is somewhat unfair, I believe, because there are other things those patents do that go beyond direct revenue. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yes, absolutely. So it's true. We probably peaked at just over $1.5 billion. It's been, 600 million to $1 billion for, many years in that zip code. Frankly speaking, the number of patents, the amount of IP, and that number could be almost anything we want it to be. But we want to take a balanced approach to using that IP. So we routinely get into discussions around, well, do we want to do a licensing deal that will bring in cash, or do we want to do a licensing and an IP deal that's a win-win with another corporation, where our technology can help that company grow, and that company is a customer or partner of ours, and so we get a return on that. So monetary licensing is something that is can go up and down, but so we have many, many ways of monetizing or leveraging. But I would say more and more since that peak, we've used it for win-win with all kinds of companies to help them grow and to help us grow. And that's, by the way, that's a big advantage of integrating it into the businesses as well.
So a question based on that, John, for David, actually. So I know you've done at Berkeley Research Group, you guys do a lot of tremendous analytics around a lot of different areas, not just intellectual property, but really when you talk about a company like IBM or even Philips, you have a big portfolio and you've got a balance that other companies can learn from, right? So companies need to make and weigh the cost of developing and maintaining a big portfolio versus the benefits that you receive from it. So what's your view of, you have to balance quality versus quantity, right? And really looking at the right sizing a portfolio and looking at it and where to prosecute, knowing it's very expensive to maintain worldwide. And how can a company really start to look at this and what should they really be focused on?
Well, look, I think metrics always do. They always are important, but Brian, you really do bring to light that patent headcounts per se, to some extent, can be manipulated. I mean, there is the process of patenting inventions, but some players wishing to look that they're actually stronger than they are have become quite good at inventing patents. And I think most people here sort of know that there's enormous heterogeneity in the value of patents. But when it gets to the media, even if it's the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, I'm always struck with how naive they are in approaching patent statistics.
Yep.
And, you know, partly it's our job to sort of help them understand that these are at best sort of indicative and trends are important. But I think this is where also we have to realize, I mean, it's interesting, the story of Philips and IBM. When you get significant royalty income coming in, you know, whether it's $1 billion or $500 million or $2 billion, yes, that leads to an understanding that there's value there. But we don't want people to think that it's just a licensing value. It's really the underlying value. And I think that's the point that's being made. And then, Bruce, that awkward question you asked. I mean, I think, you know, I'm sort of known in the academic literature for sort of two ideas, I suppose. One is the profiting from innovation framework. The other one is the dynamic capabilities, which is about not just the technologies you have, but how well you're able to deploy them and which technologies do you really invest in. So that's why the sort of integrated view of things is absolutely important. Yes, IP is important, very important, and people underappreciate it. But at the same time, so is the ability to, you know, sense, seize, and transform and roll with the punches and shape new markets and not just be shaped by them. And so, you know, that broader lens is needed as well to really give a balanced view of how IP and technology drives things. You know, even R&D statistics. I mean, I remember when Nokia was at 8% of sales in R&D and Apple was at 2% of sales in R&D early on. Now Apple is up to 8 or 9 or something like that, maybe even higher. But the 2% player beat out the 9% player. So whether it's R&D statistics or whether it's patent numbers and the size of patent portfolios, if you don't have, you know, the right leadership and the right dynamic capabilities in the organization, you know, it's not going to translate certainly in a one-to-one basis through to performance.
And I think there's a really there's a commonly known statistic that 1 to 3% of a total portfolio is actually valuable, right? So. But to John's point, you got to have bench strength because there's a perception problem as well. When you're talking with somebody and you're doing a licensing scenario that have, you know, 10 patents that you're leading with, but then you say, well, I got a bucket of 1,000 patents sitting behind it. So, I mean, there's just the perception problem does lead to that. But to your point, David, the licensing in and of itself is nice and interesting for a CFO, but looking beyond that. So for instance, at Philips, our lighting program, LED lighting program was a standard. Right, and I know Philips does, IBM does this as well, looking at a technology and trying to make it an industry standard. So you're going out generating licensing revenue, but more importantly, the whole industry is adopting it and it becomes a standardized way of doing it. In the LED space, that's the way that the LED you know, licensing program was generated just for that, and it generated lots of revenue. But more importantly, the world generated the ability to create the standard around it. So it becomes a very powerful mechanism to do that.
Yeah, Brian, if I could just add another example there, you know, in a sense, many of the components within the personal computer, the PC, were invented by IBM, whether it was the DRAM or the hard disk drive or whatever. And we held and hold most of the fundamental patents on the personal computer. But we didn't hold them and just build PCs for IBM. We opened up the standard interfaces for the bus structure, and Compaq and everyone else then went into the business, Dell, and it became, you know, PC compatible. So there are a lot of decisions you have to make around proprietary technology versus opening it up as a standard. The whole industry grows, and of course, our boat rose with that to a 20-some-odd billion-dollar PC company just within IBM. So it's more than just the IP, it's what do you keep proprietary versus what do you open up in the standard? And that's another great example of it.
Yeah. Zeeger, I got a question for you. You know, we're talking about patents quite a bit here, but can you talk a little bit about leveraging a brand and how it can be such a powerful differentiator for a value for a company, and how it can be very similar to patents being a way to leverage the brand through licensing, but most importantly, being a strong piece of IP that a company can leverage in other ways.
Yeah, no, this is I'm more on the branding side, and as you know, brands, and especially in the let's say in the fashion industry where I'm active in, licensing has been around forever, and it's generating huge revenues because we tend to diversify in all kinds of accessories. We don't have just the fashion products, but it's a whole range of products, sunglasses, watches. So licensing has always been there, and it's hugely important. I think there's quite some management attention on that piece, that there's something you can do with a brand, and it's important to keep it, to increase its value. So I think that's very well understood, these mechanics. But the question is, how do you maintain that value? How do you let it grow? How do you serve the mechanics of the licensing structure? And that is, of course, the challenge, and that's where the whole discussion about IP awareness comes in again. I think what I always tell senior management is that brand value is a process. It's not something that you create. It's not that just marketing comes up with a new brand or a new name, and then in the legal department we file a trademark and then it's done. It's a constant process. You invest in it. On marketing, they know it because they do advertising. They come up with all kinds of concepts to communicate it to the public. But it goes much further, and it's basically every function in a brand-driven company can contribute to the brand value, and that is a key message I always try to teach to senior management. And the examples are very simple. I mean, HR, for example, they have to make sure that in all the employment contracts there are the right clauses. Maybe in R&D, this question is not, well, it's also important, but on the design side, on the aesthetics part of products. It's not automatic that the company is the owner of the IP when something is being created. It depends on the jurisdiction, but this is something that needs management attention from HR. When you don't tell them, they don't realize this. Same thing in distribution. It's not just the products are there, they have to distribute it. It's also about keeping an eye on the market and telling senior management or the legal department when something's wrong, when there's an infringement. So you can go on throughout all the functions, and you have to tell them what they can do, what they should do, and this all contributes to maintaining brand value or increasing it.
Yeah, so there's lots of ways to measure brand value, and there's different reports like Interbrand. That was one when I was at Philips we paid particular attention to. But what's the best? How best can brand value be measured and communicated?
That's a big question.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's a tough question. There's a lot of attention for it. That's good. And I think in terms of brand awareness, also IP awareness, having these reports is a fantastic thing, because people start thinking about, hey, this is not just this is the value of a brand. So I think it makes it very concrete. I think what we see now. We have been studying this also at INTA, the International Trademark Association, of which I'm an officer. We have been looking into this because this is very relevant for trademarks, and it's the question is more about what is the purpose of the valuation? Who is going to use it? If you look at if it's from a financial perspective, it's a more accounting perspective. It's more about the asset value. What kind of number can you give to it? If you look at from a marketing lens, it's all about the consumer perception. How does the consumer react to something, and how strong do they connect with certain issues? You can also look at brand value from a tax perspective, and then it's more about the revenue and how. So I think it's a mix. It's also a question of definitions, and that's. I think there will be a lot of attention for it in the coming years, and how to sort that out, and looking at the relationships between these different visions you can have on brand value.
I know we talked about licensing, whether or not it's licensing a brand or licensing patents or licensing know-how or technology or copyrights, but a lot of the companies that are participating in this webinar are probably smaller companies that have maybe smaller portfolios and haven't really thought about, they don't have the luxury of a long bench strength that an IBM or a Philips had, or some of the brand companies. But, how should they start thinking about and whether or not it should fit into their overall IP strategy? I mean, if they're trying to figure out a way to leverage their R&D investment, what's the best way to start thinking about that? Yeah, I think it's a difficult task, I think, for companies. I think when you have an IP strategy, at least this is how I would think about it if I'm one of these small companies, is you've got an IP strategy, you have to balance exclusivity in the marketplace, where you want to be the only guy out there with a technology, and you want to, because really a patent is an exclusive right. It's a negative right to be able to exclude others. And if that's what you're trying to do, then you maybe want to try and enforce that and try and be the only player. But if you want to leverage your investment and go out and enable others through licensing, it's a conscious decision you have to make from a strategy perspective.
Yeah. Brian, I think that's particularly important if you've got enabling technology that's going to be applicable across multiple use cases, because small companies, typically don't have the complementary assets to do more than one or two use cases. And so licensing is really critical for small, medium-sized companies that otherwise, would have to go raise the capital to do that. So I think the business model of licensing makes different sense for different folks at different stages of their development, and it's really a complicated set of issues. But for a licensing model to work, you've got to have strong IP protection, and that's why behind it all we need the legal system and Congress and the regulatory agencies to understand IP as well, because sometimes inadvertently the competition authorities will undo a lot of what IP is trying to do. So this IP awareness has to go beyond the corporate sector to the public sector.
Yeah, great. So what about, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the area of artificial intelligence, because I think it's had a pronounced effect on intellectual property generally with respect to patent filings around AI, as well as using machine learning in developing analytics, smart analytics around being able to analyze patents and look at patent claims in an interesting way. I know at Aon we've done that, and I know IBM has done that quite a bit as well. But really, how does the shape and value of IP change in the world of AI where machines learn?
Well, Brian, let me start, since we have a lot of experience in it. It shifts a lot. It has a dramatic impact, and not just in the ways you mentioned of sort of mining IP and optimizing IP, but how to protect the IP and where the IP actually is. So with AI, there's certainly a lot of IP in the hardware and software associated with it. There's certainly a lot of IP in the algorithms associated with it. But in a sense, it's a moving target because, to a first order, it's machines that learn. And so what we have found in IBM, and particularly in the industries that we serve, whether it's financial services or healthcare, travel and transportation, retail, the intangible IP value is shifted into the data. And so the data that's used for training, the data that's used for mining, whether it's healthcare records or financial records, that is where the oil is, so to speak. And so we find ourselves working a lot more with our clients and partners around how do they protect the IP associated with their data. All the things we just talked about, how do you open up an interface to a healthcare record without losing both the individual's personal health information, but also the value that's locked in that individual plus the cohort of people that might have been in your hospital or in your payment system. So more and more AI is moving the puck, so to speak, from hardware and software and algorithms into the data, which is really the oil that's fueling this whole AI revolution.
Yeah, David, are you, I know analytics play a big part with respect to looking at using machine learning, but any thoughts on this?
Well, I find this an incredibly interesting point, and I'm just starting to understand it a little better myself. And what I hear being said here, it's the data. Well, typically we think of data as being trade secrets, is it trade secret or is it the copyright angle that's the most important? I'll put that question back to everybody because I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah, it's David. This is John again. It's not so much in the data or trying to trademark it or trade secret it. It's certain kinds of data can be mined for insights.
Yes.
Because of the richness of the data. It's like captured value from those insights, whether it's a disease or healthcare or whatever. And it's the extraction of that through AI that's really providing the value. But the core energy of the oil is locked up in that data.
So what's the protectable bit though? What are the instruments of intellectual property protection, which are the most salient? And how do they need to be managed differently from, say, what we're used to with typical trade secrets or typical copyright issues?
It's in our experience in the industries we're involved in, it's not something that you think of as patentable or trademarkable. You don't use those other instruments.
Right.
The closest thing would be the data that you hold is one of your most important, in a sense, quote unquote, trade secrets.
Oh, gotcha. So it's actually the data, the value's in the data, and it's in standard ownership of the data, whether it's the IP system, whoever you own it. But I think typically it's trade secrets that keeps that yours.
That's right. And then what do you share? Where do you share it?
Yeah.
And who are your partners? Because you typically don't have all the data you need to get the insight you need. So who do you partner with to get the other piece of data is really important in this whole field of AI.
And it's got tremendous value. I'll give you an example. We launched, recently Aon launched our own fund. We got a $400 million fund and we use for a collateral-based lending. So using your IP as collateral to obtain capital. And we're getting a number of different companies coming in, and it's not just a patent that they're using as collateral. In some cases, it's the data itself. So they have access and ownership to the data, and we're able to value that, and because it has a direct correlation to revenue. So it can be a very powerful instrument.
That's right.
So another question, I know, Zeeger, for instance, in your book, you do a great job, I think, in reflecting on how integrated IP management can have dramatic effects on brand, but you can draw correlations to other pieces of IP in order to achieve success. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays out in some of the points you made in your book to that point on this integrated IP management approach?
Yeah, it basically follows what I just mentioned. It's integrated means that you shouldn't see IP as a standalone element, and it was mentioned before in the panel. And it's something that is so core to the business, and it's a business asset. So the more you integrate it, and the broader you can make that felt through the company, the more successful you can be generally. And that is for brand-driven companies, as just explained, that is a key element. But there's still there's a lot of work to do because it's not automatic. There's a lot of awareness that has to be created, and I think we will go into it maybe in a couple of minutes about the exchange or the relationship between financial value and awareness. That is a big focus point. What we always see is that what you cannot count, you cannot manage, and so there's no management attention in that case. But yes, the integration part is is the key message. And it requires active management from senior management. Senior management cannot just say, well, we have an IP team or we have a legal department and they will take care of it. They have to understand that it's something that is on their plate, and that's where the key decisions have to be made.
Yeah, and I think what we called it at Philips was integrated intellectual asset management, IIAM. And I think the reason why and this was once again cultural inbred, because you're looking at developing an IP stack, right? You're looking at not just focusing on patents or brands. You want to integrate it, and that gets integrated into the overall IP strategy. But the key is knowing what is the right mix, what's the right blend, how many patents should you have, how many, or should your focus mainly be on more the trade secret side because you want to keep things away, because a patent claim tells the world what you're doing and you may want to keep it. So you really have to develop this integrated approach, and then you have to decide whether or not, what's the mix of organic versus inorganic growth, organically through R&D or inorganic because somebody else has developed and you can save a lot of money. So it's a buy versus build strategy, right? So it's, those are conscious decisions a company has to make. And John, I know IBM has thought a lot about this too, and curious to know your thoughts.
Well, Brian, I go back to the tendency again is to separate the IP and the IP value, this discussion, and that's that's a false decision to try to make. And I'll give maybe an example in our case. So IBM's got this huge licensing revenue, number one patent holder, blah blah blah, and then we turn around and we go out and we buy Red Hat, which is an open source company. If you come at that through an IP lens, you'd say, are these guys crazy or what? And the trouble is you're entering through the wrong door. You don't enter through an IP door. We did it for two reasons. One is Red Hat open source is a way of innovating. So if you come at it through the innovation door, Red Hat doesn't have a Yorktown Heights or Bell Labs, but it has an enormous innovation community to contribute to the company and to our clients. So through the innovation lens, you say, well, of course, that's why they did it. They now have one of the largest distributed labs in software in the world. And then if you look at the largest operating system, Linux, Red Hat. But then if you look at it through, the cloud and the fact that cloud, yes, there's some other cloud providers that jumped in first in public cloud, but only 10 or 20% of the workloads have gone to public clouds, and the remainder of it's going to be, by and large, hybrid and multi-cloud. We did a survey a year ago, and only 1 out of 200 companies said they were going to rely on one cloud. And so every company is asking us for innovation around multi-cloud and hybrid on-prem and public. And so it turns out that Red Hat has a piece of technology called OpenShift, which is the world standard for multi-cloud hybrid cloud. So when you go through that door from a business standpoint, you say, well, of course, that's why they did it. So I tell those stories because it's easy for IP experts to always come in through the IP door. Don't come in through the IP door. Go in through an innovation door or a business door first, and then figure out the IP strategy associated with that.
That makes a lot of sense. So I know we want to leave some time for questions, Bruce, but there was one other question I wanted to ask for Zeeger, and that has to do with, so we're talking about value, increasing awareness and extracting value, but does that awareness value relationship also work the other way around, namely a proper valuation of intangibles, in this case brand, really create management awareness? So what's, it's particularly relevant for internally developed trademarks or brands where under accounting rules are formally excluded as asset on the balance sheet. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that is a key asset in the branding world, or a key issue in the branding world, because it's when you can give a number to this value, then you get management attention. You need management attention to get the numbers right, but it's also the other way around, and that is a big issue about branding. We saw that there are these rankings, these brand value rankings, and they do a good job in getting the attention, but that's just external publishers who make this, and they do their evaluation work, and they make something out of it. But the company itself also needs to do it, and you do that when you have to do it or when you want to do it. But because of this exclusion of internally developed brands, those are international accounting standards. You cannot just give a number to it, even if you think it's realistic and justified. You cannot put a number on brands on your balance sheet because you're not allowed to. And that's what I said. If you cannot count it, you cannot manage it. There's no management attention. So that is a big issue. Now, the big brands, they all know how to deal with this, and they know the value of their brand, especially if they have licensing programs, etc. But especially when it comes to SMEs, we know they have no assets. And less. The only thing they have is their IP, are their intangibles. And so if they are not allowed to give a number to their brand, to what they have invested in, there's almost nothing left. So that is a very important issue. And I think this is something we, also at INTA, we are giving attention to this, because you can justify it from the past. You can say, well, this was a matter, it's too touchy. There are too many ways to give a number to it. So let's be prudent and exclude it altogether. But if you know that today a big part of the intrinsic value of a company is in the intangibles, then it's not prudent at all anymore to just leave it out. So I think that is something, we need to look at. The value gaps, I think we all know them. They're huge. I read something about, I think it was American Airlines. When was it? I think in June or July, they pledged their IP because of the crisis, of course. And I think they made public statements about the value of their IP, and IP meaning their brands and especially also their domain name. I think it was even their CFO that mentioned that it had a value of 10 billion or 12 billion US dollars. I took a look at the balance sheet, the official balance sheet published at the end of the year, and when you look at it, you intangibles, it was maybe 2 billion or something. So there's a huge gap, and the bigger the valuations, the bigger the gap in general. So a big issue in terms of creating awareness for IP on management level if there's no formal accounting value to it.
And I think that goes to the strategic planning process as well. One of the things we did when you talk about gaps is looking at coverage aspects. In other words, looking at the IP you have and seeing that direct correlation with the revenue stream. So you're selling products and services on the one hand, but if you don't have the IP that sort of covers what you're doing, then there's a gap that needs to be filled. And you got to figure out how to do that. Otherwise, you're exposed. And so that's, gets to this whole valuation aspect. How do you make that correlation happen and ensure that those gaps are addressed? So very, very important.
I think it's
Bruce.
interesting also to, and that's more for the SMEs or basically any company that hits this problem. One solution that will work anyway is doing a good IP reporting, whether you have to or not. I mean, it's a good practice, just showing what you have. And it doesn't have to be in accounting terms. You can simply list your IP. You can say, we have this, we have that. And I think a lot of SMEs and startups, they don't do this. And it hurts their funding capacity, because very often they do have IP. I advised a couple of startups, and they said, well, I don't want to do this because then competitors can see the IP that I have, the trademarks that I've held. This is public information. You can see this anyway. So let's get started. And when you see your funding partner or bank next time, at least you have something to show them.
Absolutely.
So I think we should have the audience ask some questions. You can raise your hand if you'd like. audience member and ask a question. But in the meantime, I have a question for David. David, why? Look, I know that IPs gets swept into goodwill. Why has it been such a battle to get IP recognized properly on balance sheets? What is going on to prevent that?
Well, the fundamental problem, of course, is what we've been talking around, which is it's hard to put a precise number on it. And accountants don't want to touch anything unless they can get it exactly right. I would favor putting a range or something like that, or at least having a special report. But it's diabolical because it's not there. In fact, the only category that's there is goodwill, which is M&A premium, which is almost a nonsensical measure of value. So let's take goodwill off entirely,
right.
In case people mistake what they see there for actually being the value of intangibles. So, look, accountants. There was a proposal many years ago for triple entry bookkeeping that would maybe bring the intangibles into the picture, but I don't think we're ever going to get precision. So we have to assume that, look, it's never going to be there on the balance sheet, and then start educating people, whether you're talking private enterprises or governments too, that what's the off balance sheet really deserves a lot of attention. I mean, the United States of America, every state in the country is loaded up with off balance sheet liabilities, and the whole nation, everybody, every citizen, every manager needs to be focused on what's not on the balance sheet, and almost, I wouldn't say throw the balance sheet away, but pretty much, recognize that what the accountants and the financial accountants are telling us is that they're playing around in one little corner of where value is and where value is going to be lost, and that we shouldn't get transfixed by this. While it is said if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Well, you know what? I think we have to change that. You've got to learn how to manage that which you can't measure. I mean, that's what managing under deep uncertainty is all about. So that stale old Harvard Business Review article that's 30 years old, should be thrown away, because we're never going to be able to figure out how to measure all of this stuff. And if we say we're not going to manage it, then we're making a huge mistake. And so we've got to actually change. That's why what you're doing here is so important. We've got to change the mentality of executives, and we've got to change what we teach in business schools, because we're getting increasingly numbers oriented, and managing by the numbers is, companies being managed by the numbers of, you can do that. I mean, Jack Welch did that for 15, 20 years and did it well. But they destroy as much value as they create. You can create short-term value and destroy long-term value.
Let me see, I see a question in the queue here. Don't your tax departments want to value your IP on your books as low as possible? Can create lots of tax issues. Anybody?
I confirm that this is very often a conflict that you can have in especially in marketing or brand-driven companies, maybe also in other companies. But yes, this is a management conflict that can exist. You want to keep the brand value as low as possible because it lowers your tax burden. On the other hand, the marketing department, they want to see the brand value as high as possible because that's what they are working on and that's what they want to have recognized. So those are very interesting questions.
Okay. Brian, you want to sum up? I don't have any other questions. So, okay. Brian?
Yeah, I think this has been an excellent discussion, excellent panel discussion. And thank you very much, David and John and Zeeger, for our great discussion. I think we hit a lot of topics, and hopefully people go away with a better understanding of how an IP understanding basic can translate into value and really creating this, what we call a perception premium. But that was the objective. Thank you.
Great. Yes. Thank you all, panels. Terrific panel and a great day. And a great conclusion to the fourth IP Awareness Summit. I think we achieved what we set out to. We had good attendance despite distractions and COVID, because I think the speaking and the content was so good. We will have a podcast that we're going to make out of this, and we'll have on our YouTube channel. It'll take a few weeks to put it together, but we'll have most of what was discussed the last 2 days. We do plan other events. Eventually, COVID permitting, we want to do live events. Again, we did successfully at Berkeley last year with the help of David and others, and we'll do more. But in the interim, doing this sort of thing, it opens it up to a wider audience and keeps the dialogue going. James, any concluding thoughts on your part? You're muted. You're muted.
Now
Oh,
I'm
thank you.
unmuted.
Okay.
Oh,
Thank you. But Dr. West, did you want to add anything?
no, I answered to James too, so you go ahead.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Dr. West. Thank you to all the panelists yesterday and today who have actually shine light on this greater theme about IP and all the lives touches, whether it's the minority community that Ellington West brought to our attention in her panel, and or the broader concern about the rising collection of IP in China and across Asia, or the education question, right? We really hit on a good point. I was interested in scale, and David Teece was interested in, well, is there demand? And then finally, this value perception question. We've actually hit what are sort of both the challenges and the opportunities for all of us. We are the community that are invested in this group of assets. We have great academic foundation for this, but we need to somehow figure out how to organize in a way that allows us to harness the opportunities in front of us. And it's going to happen at the legislative level, the educational level, both at top universities across the land grants and in the K through 12 community. We'll look for the great inventors like James West to take us forward with great examples that we can use to change the narrative.
Great. Well, thank you all, and we'll do this again soon. And it was terrific and very productive 2 days. Thanks again.